G'day and welcome to the E-Cave. In this episode, I have another update on my dead PS2 motherboard, which you saw in the last episode. Have I fixed it? Have I made progress? Or is it totally dead? Well, why not step into the E-Cave and join me? Well, thanks for joining me in the E-Cave. Yes, I've put a lot of effort into diagnosing the dead motherboard, and rather than tell you straight away what I found, I can tell you I made progress. It's not fixed yet, but I do have an idea. So the first thing I, of course, did put it onto the workbench and surrounded myself with an oscilloscope, logic analyzers, and some tools. So let's get to that first. All right. Here I have the motherboard from the first PS2 model 30286. Yes, it's pretty dead. I've got it set up. The new CPU is here. Now, I know the RAM is good. I've tested that in the other one, in the second one. I know the Dallas clock chip is good. I also know the BIOS chip is good. That is a BIOS chip from the other one, which I've been using to test. So, without further ado, I'll put the phone down and we'll put this CPU in and see what happens. Is it still dead or is it gonna work? I've got my oscilloscope set up there just in case, and this little current limiter is bypassed. It just tells me the amount of current and power the power supply draws. And yes, I've tested the power supply and in the other one and it works fine. All the voltages are good. So I'll put this here to the side and we'll put in the CPU. Hopefully not too much glare on this, but anyway. Okay, now I'll put on my anti-static strap. No reason to blow these things up with static. The CPU goes in like this. And then you just push down. To get it out, I didn't show that, but what I normally do, I use a bit of a hook like this one. Just something you can get, and you do it like that on the corners, levering it out. But let's leave it there. Clock ready, everything's ready. I've got a monitor, but something tells me nothing's going to happen. But anyway, power on. All right, the VGA monitor is completely dead. As you can see, nothing. So, what do we do then? Well, first things first, We know the memory is good. We know the voltages are fine. Basically, what we need to do is to start looking at the CPU and see if we have any activity on the CPU. So the best thing to do, I'm just getting, I printed out the CPU manual, which gives us the pinout for the CPU. Let me see. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So that's the manual for the CPU. And here we have the pinout. And that's what I'll use to probe the pins on CPU. I'm capturing the output of the oscilloscope, so I can throw that up. Now, the first thing I want to check are the clocks. The CPU should be getting a clock on pin. Let me see. The orientation is like that. So it would be the fourth pin from the bottom. So let's see what we get on the oscilloscope. So I need a ground. Let's get a ground here close to the CPU. And we set the third, did I say A0, A1, fourth pin is a clock. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And what are we getting? 20 megahertz. That's exactly what we expected. It's a 10 megahertz CPU and 20 megahertz goes into the CPU. It divides it by 2, so it's happy with that. So we do have a clock going in. The next important pin is the reset pin. And as it happens, it's not far from the clock chip, it's just the next over. So let me check that. 2, 3, 4, that was the clock. This is the plus. Is this ground? See. 2, 3. Yeah, that's the plus 5 volts. And the next one over is the reset line. And it is low. Now, what's supposed to happen is supposed to go high and then low. That's exactly what it does. All right. That's working. Now, one of the things that might be of interest is to see if there's any activity on the BIOS ROM. I'll get a ground here on the crystal. Oops. Yes, the BIOS chip is the one here with the grey tape. We need the pin out for that one. And I've got that here, you can see that's the 27C210. and it's facing this way. So we have all the data lines closer to us and the address lines further away. So I'll try one of the data lines and see if there's any activity. Data 0 is pin 19, which is this one here. Okay, it's high. 1, data 1, which is pin 18, 17, 16. So all the data lines appear to be non-functional. What about chip enable? Is that? There's nothing happening here. Let's see what happens if I power it off and on. I'm on chip enable. Power off. Power on. I don't see anything happening here. What about the data lines? Say data line 0. Okay, aha. Did you see that? Something, there was some data activity and then it just stops. This is pin 20, OE. I find this a bit weird. Let's look at the chip enable while we turn it off. Yeah, there's a bit of activity on that. Let's try this again with the horizontal frequency on the scope. Yeah, did you see that? We saw some pulses. So obviously we're getting something happening to begin with. Here's another data line. This is data line, I think it's pin 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which would be data line 13. Yep. All right. So we're getting activity in the beginning and then it just stops. Now, my understanding is that these motherboards output diagnostic data to the parallel port. So let's try that. I'll have to find it here. Here it is. So that's this little gizmo here. Apparently, I'm just got a battery pack for it. We'll just plug it here into the parallel printer port. So you can see there. Hopefully, I'll take the oscilloscope away. Then we plug some power in. Okay. Be interesting to see if we get anything. Let's power on. There's some activity. Something happened. Let me see. There's F00. There's buttons here, previous, next. And if there was any output, we can see what the output was. All right, we had 01, or 00, 01, 02, 03, 04, 04 is the last diagnostic code coming out. That's interesting. Now, according to the Ardent tools, I've got I think I should have the codes. Here are the codes. Now, these are the CP codes for ROM-based systems. Now, we have 00, we have 01, 02, 03, and 04. So my understanding is the code is sent and then it proceeds to do the testing. But it does say here, port registers port 1 or 2 enabled and checked. Now, I think this is actually microchannel based information. So this is for the microchannel machines. This, remember, is an ISO machine. So I've gone to -0 degrees and I looked at the boot codes for the 8286 AT. Let me show you that. All right, you should be seeing the -0 degree website there. These are the codes. Now we have 01, 02, 03, and 04. And this is the last diagnostic codes we get out. Now it's saying, is testing the 8254 channel 1. So channel 1 of the 8254 timer chip. Now, of course, this motherboard does not have 8254 timer chip, which means that's not something we can explore. But what it does have a third-party chip, which includes the timer chip, and that's this guy here, VL82C100, and the 8254 timer chip is integrated into that. You can see that here on the block diagram for that chip. Basically, they've integrated a lot of stuff into it, and thankfully it's a chip that's probably available, but it gives us an opportunity to look at what's happening around that chip. One of the things that may have happened here is when I was taking out the CPU socket, which is here, one of the things that I had to do was to flip this board over and then heat it from the bottom. And up to about 100, 110 degrees, it is possible something's happened to that chip. Alternatively, one of the legs. But let me ponder this a bit and see if I can come up with a strategy to continue to see if we can resurrect it. Now the VLSI chip, which contains the 8254 timer, is called VL82C100 and is called a peripheral controller. I initially tried to probe the motherboard around that VLSI chip, which has that timer, and it's this one here, as you can see, VL82C100. Now if you look inside that chip, actually you can see the 8254 timer is here, and you get a signal called out2, and there's another signal driving another block here, but you can also probe the input to it, and trust me, I looked at all the inputs and outputs without any luck. Now, it then occurred to me that perhaps the IBM AT error codes are not applicable to this particular model PS2 machine, being an isobus machine. Although identical to the AT, they might have different power on self-test routine. So one of the things that occurred to me was, well, why don't I try the diagnostic parallel port card in the functional machine? And I'll show you what happened there. This is the second PS2 Model 30 286 machine, which is working fine and you've seen before. I've taken out the Dulles chip and I've put the parallel port diagnostic card on the parallel port. I'll show you what happens when I power it on without the Dulles chip. Note the last code we see, 04. My suspicions have been confirmed. That tells me there's something wrong with the communication to the Dulles chip on the other one. So we'll have to have a look at that. Well, as you see, the machine that's got the good planar stops on error code 04 as well when the Dulles chip is missing. So identical to the faulty motherboard. Now, how can we confirm this, that this diagnostic code does not apply to the 8254 timer? Well, you'd have to look into the BIOS ROM and disassemble it. Well, thankfully, someone had actually done that. And I could access that disassembly. Although they didn't disassemble the code or the BIOS I was using, if you go to the Ardent website, they have the different ROM BIOS versions or bin files here for the Model 30 286, and the first one was 27F4092. Now, what happens if we look at that disassembled? Can we disseminate something out of that? And let me pull that in here. So I've got IDA Pro here, and you can see it here. It was disassembled by Ricardo. I'll put a link to that down below for you. And this is a 27F4092 BIOS, and he has kindly made that available on GitHub. Now, the first area of, or first port of call is the reset vector. This actually comes from the end of the BIOS, where you have the start vector the 8286 goes to, and it tells it to jump up here. And as you can see here, it's doing testing. It's probably testing the CPU and the registers here. And then it does the keyboard. I think what it's doing here is actually checking if the manufacturing mode is on or not. And then it does some CMOS memory, which is the real-time clock chip or the Dulles chip. But it doesn't fail here. Where it actually fails, if you come down a bit further, it's probably doing some more testing, but once you get down here further, you can see that it's beginning to send something out to the printer port. Now, normally printer ports are 378, but they're also 3BC is a printer port. And it puts a code into the AL register and sends that out. And now, I'm no expert at decoding assembly language, but I could muddle through this and see that it is sending codes to the printer. Let me go a bit further here. So here is putting 2 into the AL register, and then it's sending that, then it moves hex 190 into the DX register, and then it says out DX AL, which is the 2. Now, I don't know where 190 goes to. I haven't found any information about that particular port, but it does the same thing with the printer port, and I'm guessing this 2 is what displays 02 on the parallel printer diagnostic port. Well, I'm not guessing, I'm pretty certain. Now, if you go further, it does a BIOS checksum, which you would expect. It does some VGA checksum, and then it does a memory test. I don't know how extensive that memory test is, but it's part of diagnostic code 3, which you see here going into AL, once again out to 190 hex, and then out to the parallel printer port 3BCH. Now that memory test obviously succeeds, because it continues to do that until we get to a section further down below here where it puts 4 into AL, sends it out to 190. Once again, it sends 4 out to the parallel printer port, and here's our diagnostic code, last diagnostic code, where it fails. And then it starts doing some CMOS memory testing again, and fails, and goes into a halting state. Now, if you continue this scrolling down, you can see 5 here, and then it goes to, let me see, 6, and so on and so on. You can actually see the diagnostic codes that are being sent to the printer port here. And once I had that, I realized, well, this is probably confirming my suspicions that the AT diagnostic codes do not apply. Well, what do you do then? I then proceeded to probe all the pins on the Dallas chip and see all the signals coming in and out of it. And for the life of me, I could not see anything missing or wrong. I spent a fair bit of time doing it, and I used the other motherboard which is working for comparison. And as far as I could see, or I couldn't see any errors or missing bits. So in the end, I resorted to putting in a logic analyzer onto the pins of the Dallas chip. So let me show the logic analyzer traces. Let me pull that in here. Now I probed the XD0 to XD7 lines, and the data strobe, the address strobe, the read-write signal, and the IRQ, plus the reset coming into the chip. And what I could see, if I probed the faulty motherboard, it would generate all the same signals as the one that is working, probably about 180 milliseconds. I think it was 186.5 milliseconds, it suddenly just stops. And on the good motherboard, if I did exactly the same thing, it would simply continue. And if I compared the logic analyzer traces for the first 186 milliseconds from both machines, they were practically identical. There was no indication of anything missing or a signal being distorted or absent. So I was pretty devastated, and I was just about to give up on this when something occurred to me that causes or could cause these problems. Now, I don't know why I didn't think of it before, but let me show you what actually happened. Now, as I've told you before, the board would occasionally boot up and give me asynchronous RS-232 errors, i.e. 1101, on top of the usual suspects. So I was a bit perplexed, but let me show you what happened next. All right, I think I've got something, finally. Let me show you what's happening. I'll power the board on, and as usual, it will fail on 0, 4. Now, I'll power it on, and as expected, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ah, it's gone a bit further now. But I'll tell you why. Well, I think it's doing memory test. But it's outputting some VGA, but I can't see anything on the monitor yet. But the monitor is active. But anyway, what I want to show you is, after a lot of pondering about this issue, as I've explained, it occurred to me that the instability I'm experiencing wasn't related to heat or cold. Yes, I've used both of those on some of the chips to see if there's any thermal expansion or cooling that works on this intermittent problem. But then I thought, well, what else could it be? Well, as it turns out, there are 5 crystal oscillators on this board. As you can see, there's a 40 megahertz crystal oscillator here. There's a 20 megahertz here, small one, another 14.3. This is a 25175 megahertz, and that's a 28 megahertz crystal oscillator. Now these two feed into the VGA chip, which is a custom chip by IBM. Thankfully, that is practically, well, one of 2 custom chips on this board. The others, as I've said, are VLSI chipset. But let's look at the crystal oscillators, these 2 here. Now, I'll show you on the oscilloscope. When I scope this one, it says 28.323 megahertz, but you can see the output is what spans 2, 4, almost 6 volts peak to peak, which is, as I guess, is normal. But when I look at this one here, which is the 25175 megahertz, yes, it barely gets out 2 volts. It's pretty pathetic. Now, I might be tempted to think this is normal, but thankfully I do have another identical board I can test. Now, through magic of time machine, I'll put the other board in and we'll do exactly the same measurement. All right, the motherboard from the second PS2 machine is now hooked up and ready to be fired up. So I'll do that. And that board works fine. Still, despite all my testing, which tells you how robust these things are. I've got a cursor up there on the monitor. And I've got 601, 162, it's not happy. But anyway, let's look at the crystal oscillators on this one. So the 28 megahertz one here, as you can see, has a similar output to the other one, which is good. But when I look at this one, sorry, you see it has a similar output as the other one. That is the 28 megahertz. It's almost 5-6 volts peak to peak, which tells me there's something wrong with the crystal oscillator on the first motherboard. I've of course checked the other 3, the little ones here and that one, and the power output from those is similar on the 2 boards. What I've also noticed when I put the scope on the pin here to measure the voltage and frequency on the other board, it kicks into life and starts doing things. Like I've said before, it does do that from time to time, but not very often. It would boot up and be okay maybe every 10 to 20, once out of every 10 to 20 instances I powered it on. Sometimes I'd power it on 30 times and it didn't do anything. Sometimes I was doing some research, came back and powered it on and it would suddenly work. So I've got to source this crystal. I've got no idea where I can source these crystals. Ideally, I'd like to get a modern replacement, but if you have any ideas, please let me know down below. I've measured the voltage on it. From ground and pin to pin is 2.5 volts. So it needs a new crystal oscillator, which is good. So I'll have to park this once again until I source parts. Now, I'd previously shown you the logic analyzer traces, and I'm sure you're wondering, how do you tap into the Dulles chip when these pins are socketed down there? And putting the logic analyzer probes, well, there's no space for them. The alternative would be to solder something underneath the board or tap into it on the chips, but I didn't want to go that far. I actually cheated a bit, so I was going to make a board using standard headers, but the headers on the normal headers, they're too fat. So these pins are very flat, but the pins on the headers are just too fat to fit into that socket properly. So I found some Arduino headers, which are these guys. They have a thinner pin profile than normal headers. So I could plug them in there like that, and then I simply put another socket like this. There we are. And I could put that down into the board, and then the Dallas chip came on top. And now I've got access to the pins, so I could simply clip my probes onto the pins, as you see here. And that's the way I did that. Now, I also showed you I use this to take the CPU out. It's powered on still. Let me turn the power off. Which is okay if you only do it once or twice, but if you have to do it multiple times, I would suggest you get a proper tool like this one. Actually, it works a lot better because it actually slots in the into the slots down there, and these what you would call forks go under the chip, and you just pull it out. Dead easy. This is where I'm at. Well, as you saw, I'm now in the need of a crystal, which is 25.175 megahertz. I'm not used to replacing these crystals, so I didn't know exactly whether I could replace it with a 4-pin one or one of the smaller ones. I actually have a small 25 megahertz crystal I actually put in and replaced it with, but the output from that was very low, and of course the frequency not as accurate. I did find a website selling the same size crystal with the same frequency, and they do say it's intended for the VGA chips. So I decided to fork out some money and get a couple of those. I'll show you up here the website. I actually got it through eBay because the company's in the US and they don't send directly from the US other than through eBay. However, it won't arrive until, I guess, December, so I'll have to wait until then. But I just don't want to spend more time on this board until I have a proper crystal in place. Although it does feed the VGA chip, I'm pretty sure there are some interactions happening that cause the motherboard to fail like that. Now, as to the second PS2 3206, you can see it here, cleaned up and working. It has the 2 meg SIMs I modified and put into it, because when I originally opened it up, it didn't have any RAM SIMs in there. But it did have this memory expansion board, which is actually 5 megabytes according to the switches. And the switch that is supposed to designate onboard memory says none. Now, if you remember, that board would fail with the accelerator board, the Kingston accelerator board, which was already there. And I took it out and put a stock standard 10 megahertz CPU into it. But I looked at the specs for those RAM chips, and they're 17 nanoseconds, whereas the ones on that 30-pin SIMs are, I think they're about 100, 120 nanoseconds. So, and maybe that is why it was freezing on occasions with that accelerator board. It might be interesting to put that board in, remove the 30-pin SIMs, and with that memory expansion, maybe it will work and I get a 5 megabyte system. So that's something I'll try. But at least I have one functional machine, and I'm quite happy with that. I'm still hopeful on the first one and won't give up yet. Now, for some of the things I've talked about, I'll put a link down below so you can go to the websites like the GitHub from Ricardo. If you're watching this, Ricardo, thanks very much for that disassembly using IDA Pro. I tried to use IDA Pro myself on the current version of the BIOS, but it was asking for segments and base registers and stuff like that. And although I have some rudimentary knowledge on that, I couldn't work it out in a short time. However, Ricardo's disassembly is fairly identical because I did search with a hex editor through the current version, and I did find the same outputs to the parallel printer port opcodes. So I'm pretty confident that his disassembly is very close to what the later BIOS are now. So I'll put some links to that, and I'll put the link to IDA Pro as well, version 5, which is free. And you can only use IDA Pro version 5 because the later version have deprecated the 16-bit or the 8-bit disassembly capability for these old machines. Now, I did learn a lot from this adventure with Dead Motherboard. I learned a lot about the Dallas chip. I figured out a fair few things I didn't know. So what I might do, I might give this a test and then tell you about some of the learnings from this episode until I get the crystal and I can proceed with a Dead Motherboard. I also have yet to start with the third machine, which has the older planar. So that's waiting in the wings as well. And I haven't forgotten about the diskette drives. Now, all three of them are working. The mechanical problem on the one with that extra functions, as you saw, or I think it's an eject assist mechanism, as you saw in the second episode. I haven't progressed that apart from putting JB Weld on it. I still haven't worked out the best way to reinforce it. But more about that later. So thanks very much for joining me in the eCave today.